You also have the Thiel Foundation that has these three elements to it. And one of the elements is the Thiel Fellowships, in which you get like 30 awards a year.
20 a year, yeah.
20 a year. 2-year award for people to do great research. I'm assuming that part of this is your dismay about the current state of American universities. That there's a kind of creativity or innovation that's either not sufficiently nourished or not sustained or even damped down in American universities. And since I'm a university professor, I have tenure, so I could say what I want, but nevertheless, I think universities and what we do for our students is amazing things. But you have a jaundiced view of American universities. So tell us why.
Well, it's always I certainly think that we are in something of an educational bubble. Is the way I always like to describe it. You know, we've been in an age of bubbles in all sorts of areas, and I think there's also a bubble in education, and it's manifested by the ever-rising tuition costs on universities. So the question of what universities are doing is a very different question at a certain tuition level. And if the tuition is 4 times as much, which is roughly what they've risen since 1980, adjusted for inflation, you'd end up with a very different set of questions. We now have $1.3 trillion of student debt. It was only $300 billion in 2000. It's gone up by something like a factor of 4 in nominal dollars in 15 years. And so I think at that level, we have to ask far more critical questions about, is the education worth the debt that people are assuming? And it's a very pernicious form of debt because under President Bush 43, they rewrote the bankruptcy laws so you can never get out of student debt even if you go personally bankrupt. And you pay off your student debt for the rest of your life. And if you haven't paid it off by the time you're 65, they garnish your Social Security to pay off your student loans. And so I think it's sort of incumbent on us to ask some very tough questions about how well education is actually working, because it has taken on these very different roles, and because of the enormous costs that are being attached to it. The economic sort of description of it is often, what kind of a good is education? Is it an investment? So you're going to college as an investment into a future? Or is it a consumption good, where it's like a 4-year party? And these are 2 very different kinds of things. And often, when I started my critique of colleges, I thought it was sort of a weird superposition of an investment good and a consumption good, which is why people were confused. So they thought they were investing, but they were really consuming. But I've now come to think that it's actually a combination of 2 things that are much crazier than those 2 even. It's, on the one hand, it's the main reason people go to college is actually as an insurance product, where people go to college because they're scared of falling through the very big cracks in our society. And so even if it's not a great investment, it's still important to buy insurance. This is why parents save up so much money to send their kids to college, and then why the kids take out so much in student debt. And so I think we should, and whenever people are spending this much on insurance, I think we should be asking the underlying question, why have the cracks in our society gotten so big that people are spending more and more on insurance? And that would be a good question for us to ask. And then in some ways it gets obscured by the education piece. So on the one hand, it's an insurance product. Right. But then on the other hand, it's on some level, it's a tournament where, which is the exact opposite of an insurance, where especially the sort of elite universities are driven by exclusion. And the sort of the thought experiment I give is, if you were the president of Harvard or Stanford or any of these places, if you wanted to get lynched by a mob of students, faculty, and alumni, what you should do is you should give a speech saying that because you're such a great college and you're educating people so well, you're going to triple enrollment. And it's because the value of the elite universities comes from excluding people. What they really are is it's like a Studio 54 nightclub, where you want there to be an enormous line of people outside and you don't want to let anybody in. And that's what a tournament looks like. And that's very different from an insurance policy. And so when you conflate a tournament with an insurance policy and superpose those two, I think you end up with some really wacky decisions.